Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we're in the Pampa El Cepillo GI of the southern Uco Valley in Mendoza, and we're looking at the El Enemigo 2015 Gran Enemigo El Cepillo Cabernet Franc. El Enemigo was established by legendary winemaker and agronomist Alejandro Vigil and Argentinian wine royalty Adriana Catena in 2008. The project was born out of the desire to experiment, showcase terroir, and veer off the beaten path a little bit, if you will. They chose to chart a slightly unconventional course in Argentinian wine, and yet they remain anchored in the passion and vision to showcase the vineyard characteristics above all else in the finished wines. Now, if there had to be a flag bearer for Cabernet Franc in Argentina, it would be undoubtedly Alejandro Vigil. He chose to make Cabernet Franc the leading grape for El Enemigo because he believes in its ability to be a mirror for terroir, something I think the grape is capable of as well. The winery makes 5 Cabernet Francs, 4 of which are part of this Gran Enemigo range, which is this range of super premium single vineyard bottlings. These 4 Cabernet Francs are coming from distinct micro-terroirs within Mendoza, and arguably the most famous of the 4 is the bottling from Gualtieri and Tupungato, but today we're looking at this example from the Pampa El Cepillo Indicación de Geográfica in San Carlos, which is in the southern part of the Uco Valley. Now, I've talked a little bit about the regions in the Uco Valley before, but quickly, again, there are 3 subregions in the Uco Valley. We have Tupungato in the north, Tunuyán in the center, and then San Carlos is the furthest south. And of course, we are in the southern hemisphere here, so as we move south, we're moving further away from the equator, and thus we're getting into cooler and cooler microclimates. So of these 3 regions, San Carlos is the smallest. It has about 8,700 hectares under vine, and it is a little bit more removed than the other 2. It's a bit more remote. We're right now situated about 110 kilometers directly southwest of the city of Mendoza, and because of how the Uco Valley is shaped, San Carlos is actually a little bit more isolated. We have the Tunuyán River to the north, and then the region stretches about 42 kilometers from north to south, which is a fair size geographically speaking, and there is quite a bit of diversity here. So much so that there's actually 7 subregions within San Carlos, but only 2 of them have received GI status. That's Paraje Altamira, which is arguably the most famous of the 2 and tends to get all the limelight in terms of press, and then we have Pampa El Cepillo, which is of course where today's wine is taking us. So, Pampa El Cepillo received its GI status in 2019 based exclusively on geological and climate data, which is rare in Argentina. Most GIs are established based on political borders, but both Paraje Altamira and Pampa El Cepillo received their GI status based on essentially terroir characteristics. So where we are in Pampa El Cepillo, we're a little bit further south than Paraje Altamira, and we are at a slightly lower elevation, which is relative because we're still dealing with high altitude Cabernet Franc here, but the elevation is upwards to 1,100 meters above sea level. Now, the combination of the southerly latitude as well as high elevation actually makes Pampa El Cepillo the coldest region in the Uco Valley, and so cold in fact that actually frost is a concern here. And when I was doing my research on this particular region, I noted from Amanda Barnes's amazing book on South American wine that the locals actually refer to Pampa El Cepillo as La Heladera, which means the fridge. So today's wine is coming from a 9-hectare parcel of vines that's on a very gentle slope towards the southeast. The vines were planted in the mid-1990s at a relatively high density, about 10,000 to 12,000 vines per hectare. The vineyard is farmed organically, and they have installed drip irrigation, which is of course very common in Mendoza because of how little rainfall the region receives. Now, in terms of soils here, the soil is what we call colluvium, which is it's basically formed through eroded materials, and it's deposited via gravity, and it's different from alluvium or alluvial soils, which I've talked about in some other videos, which are soils that are transported via moving water. And there are some distinct differences between these 2 soils, but most importantly here, colluvium tends to be a bit more heterogeneous in terms of its texture, so there's a lot less uniformity in terms of the particle size versus alluvial soils. But what we're dealing with here in this vineyard is a mix of sand as well as silt, and then we have these marine limestone stones in the subsoil. Now, from a winemaking perspective, there's a few important things that I want to note here. First and foremost, the fruit was all hand harvested, and it was actually harvested in 5 distinct passes over the course of 6 weeks. So they were picking the fruit at various stages of ripeness, and this is to get different fruit, acid, as well as tannin profiles in the finished wine. All of these lots were fermented individually, but they all more or less underwent the same procedure. So all of the wines were fermented in smaller, older oak barrels. They did a 5-day cold soak, and then the fermentation takes place with indigenous yeast, and the time on skins would vary depending on how ripe the fruit was. So a little shorter for less ripe fruit, and then a little longer for more ripe fruit, but the average time on skins was about 23 days. And they actually they left 30% of the fruit whole cluster. And then in terms of the élevage, once the fermentation is complete, they make their barrel selection and then they do an assemblage, and then that wine is then transferred into these 100-year-old large oak foudres where they rest for 15 months before bottling. I should note as well that this wine is 85% Cabernet Franc with 15% Malbec, and the Malbec is actually interplanted with the Cabernet Franc in the vineyard. And also I wanted to mention that for anybody that may have these Gran Enemigo wines at home, all 4 of them are vinified exactly the same. Now, I haven't done this exercise myself as much as I want to, or hopefully I can do this at some point, but it would be a fun exercise to open all 4 of them side by side, and then to kind of note the different characteristics within each of the wines in terms of fruit profile, acid, tannin, etc. And then finally, as another final point, we are dealing with high altitude Cabernet Franc here. So much as we are in a cooler region in the Uco Valley, we have altitude here. Of course, altitude means that we're closer to the sunshine, to the sun, I should say, and that means we have increased solar radiation, which is going to give us thicker skins, and that will lead to greater tannins, as well as color, as well as flavor in the finished wine. So let's tuck in. And the nose has a really nice mix of red fruits as well as some darker fruits. And the fruits do lean really fresh, actually. Fresh and sweeter fruits, I should say, as well. And it's a nice mix of red cherry. There's a bit of black cherry here, a touch of like a black currant juice as well. And I would definitely say that this wine is a bit more fruit forward, but of course there is a nice underpinning of earthiness or savoriness, which comes through for me as a bit of a thyme, a bit of bay leaf. There's a touch of cedar or some sort of evergreen note as well. And then there is a really lovely perfume to this wine. I would say that it's floral in nature, but definitely it's more like pink flowers, like roses or something, not quite purple flowers, which is what is often typical with Cabernet Franc. Now, on the palate, all those same fruits come through really, really nicely. And the wine is quite primary in nature, which makes sense. You know, it's a relatively youthful wine. I would like to see this in about 5 or so years' time to see where those fruits go. But I do quite like the fruit profile and how fresh it is. And then in terms of acidity, this is really vibrant, really refreshing, cleansing acidity. I can almost feel my mouth watering as I'm tasting. It's quite nice. Tannins, you know, they're definitely riper tannins, firm, and they have a nice supple texture in the mouth, which is quite nice. They do fill the mouth in a nice way. There's a moderate amount of tannin here. Something, you know, obviously this wine is intended for longer term aging, so there is a bit more tannin here. They finish with a nice velvety texture with a bit of chew to it as well. This wine has a very good structure, well contoured, well chiseled. The way the acid and the tannin are working together with the fruit, supremely imbalanced. And I love how the acid really refreshes. You know, this wine is full-bodied, it's got some weight to it, it's got some density, but it also is very elegant, very restrained, and there's a lot of finesse here as well. What's interesting when I was making my notes on this wine is it actually reminds me of something from the alluvial soils in Chinon, which might sound a little bit crazy to people, but it reminds me of some of my favorite wines from Cravon-les-Coteaux and some of these other places. But it's as if the volume has been jacked up on this wine, which makes sense. We're dealing with high altitude Cab Franc here, so there's more intensity in terms of tannin and fruit and whatnot. But it's really interesting how there are some similarities between the fruit profile, the texture, and everything like that this wine is doing. Another thing that I noted that it made me, as far as trying to think of analogies for describing this wine, it's as if a musician who typically plays their songs acoustic does a different version of one of their, more popular songs as an electric version. And initially when you hear it, you're kind of like, oh, you're a bit taken aback because it's different from what you're used to. But at the same time, there's a familiarity to it that, within, after a few listens, you get into it and you're like, yeah, I totally dig this version, as much as it's maybe not the one that you're most familiar with. And this is kind of what this wine is doing for me today. It's such a delicious wine. It's really, really quite outstanding. If you've had any of the Cabernet Francs that are part of the Gran Enemigo range, or even the entry-level Cab Franc, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. This is in fact my first Gran Enemigo Cabernet Franc, and I'm really happy with the quality, just the balance. It's really quite outstanding. So if you've had one of these wines, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.